It's my pleasure to introduce Stephanie Cairns, who will chair this session on climate and resilience. So Stephanie is the Senior Director of Strategy and Foresight at the Pacific Institute for Climate Solution, PICS. Over the past 30 years, she's worked on energy, climate, and carbon pricing policies, circular economy, and sustainable communities with leading non-governmental organization, research institute, and expert panel. Stephanie was the first woman appointed as national president of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, is a past chair of the Galiano Conservancy Association, and currently serves as coordinating lead author for the North American Biodiversity and Climate Change Assessment. So please join me in welcoming Stephanie to lead this final session.
Thank you. And could I ask my panelists to come up, please? Thank you so much, and welcome to the last panel of the day. I want to open by sharing my respect and acknowledgement to the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory we are holding this session, and specifically the Songhees and Esquimalt peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And I also, in keeping with the Halloween date of this session, I'm going to characterize the session as being a bit about how we move past looking at the ghosts of climate past to inform our resource planning, and instead start to allow the specters of climate future and allow them into our planning rooms. Because this session is really about what the role is of climate adaptation and adaptation planning in thinking about energy security. So we've spent a lot of the day today talking about energy security and the role of interties in supporting the clean energy transition and, managing many of the energy mitigation driven changes that are happening around demand for electricity, new sources of power generation, new demand side technologies, new storage resources. But of course, there's another side to what's happening on the climate issue, and that is accelerating climate impacts and the growing need to start thinking about that very significantly changing future in all of our energy planning. So climate resilience as one component of electricity security, if you look at the International Energy Agency's work on this, they define it as being the ability to anticipate, absorb, and accommodate and recover from the effects of potentially hazardous events related to climate change. And they include three components to what's needed. Robustness to withstand long-term changes in climate patterns, resourcefulness to continue operation during immediate shocks such as extreme weather events. And we've all had, unfortunate recent experiences around heat domes and wildfires and, extreme wind events, floods and droughts, and all of these are affecting, how electricity is both generated and transmitted and distributed. And finally, the third aspect that they look at is recovery, the ability to restore function after a climate hazard-induced disruption. So I want to give credit to the province of BC, which is actively considering these issues, and I think is really a leader in Canada in integrating thinking about climate resilience into its thinking around emergency management planning and disaster risk assessments. They have introduced new requirements for critical infrastructure owners and operators to conduct to include consideration of climate change into new disaster risk assessments that are being required. And the province itself is including climate resilience as a component of its provincial and regional disaster risk and resilience assessments. In addition, there has been a number of of components of recent BC Utility Commission decisions that have started to address this question about how climate resilience is going to be built into long-term resource planning. So it is a growing issue at a provincial level. We had really hoped to bring that experience to the panel today, but unfortunately we're still in the interregnum period, post-election interregnum period, which means that nobody from a BC government agency or BC government department is able to speak to these issues. But I did want to acknowledge all the excellent work that is underway in addressing these issues. Nonetheless, we have a very different set of experience to bring today to our workshop. A wealth of applied experience in planning for climate resilience and for supporting others to understand future risks and planning for resilience. So first up, we have Professor Magnus Karpas, who is visiting us from Norway, and he is from the Electricity Markets and Energy System Planning Research Group at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and a former research director of the Energy Systems Department at Sintef Energy Research, which is an applied research institute dedicated to creating innovative energy solutions. And he is very involved in so many different activities in the European space. He leads the work package on flexibility in the Norwegian Research Center for Intelligent Electricity Distribution. He is part of the European Academy of Sciences Working Group on Security of Sustainable Energy Supplies. And as well, he leads the work package on markets for the Wind Technology Collaboration Program of this International Energy Agency's Task 25 group. And he's going to tell us about the Norwegian experience in building climate resilience into their system. So welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you all for being here, and thanks to Madeline for inviting me. So I will give a bit of experience from the Norwegian and Nordic, and will also say European perspective regarding how to plan for changing conditions. I would like to start just to give a background in, can see how similar the power systems actually are in Norway and here in BC. We are dependent on reservoir hydropower to a large extent, and that also means that we are completely dependent on the inflow patterns of the rainfall and snowfall. We have a reservoir system that is built from, let's say, natural lakes and dams, and there are actually more than 800 reservoirs that the Norwegian hydropower system consists of, and more than 1,000 individual power plants. Our hydropower system has long-term storage, meaning seasonal and multi-year storages. So I would say that we are already extremely have a very weather-dependent power system. Which brings me to I would say, like the core of the message here is, I would say, to show how important the interconnection between the different areas in Norway and in the Nordic power system, and how we connect that our system to the rest of the European power grid really is. Because since we have now we have 90% hydropower, we produce around 140 terawatt hours of hydropower production each year, and 10% wind power. We benefit a lot from being connected to the rest of the Nordic power system, and this interconnection benefits, I think, was first recognized in the 60s, 50s and 60s. And the first interconnector between Norway and Denmark was built in the 70s. Around when I was born, the first interconnector was also born, because the thermal systems of our neighboring countries interacted very well with the hydropower system. So we had a thermal-based, capacity-limited system connected to an energy resource-limited system. So we were kind of used to this type of co-benefits of transmission long before we started with variable renewable integration and climate change mitigation. Also the Norwegian power system is already the energy system is very much electricity dependent, meaning that we have heating is electric, heat pumps and direct heating. We have a lot of heavy industries that needs a large amount of stable power supplies, because the Norwegian hydropower system can provide cheap and clean electricity. It's also very attractive historically to build industries, heavy industries in Norway and in the Nordics. And as together with being very interconnected with the rest of the European power system, we also have an integrated electricity market. So basically, it's the same power price. The power pricing, it's cleared on a European level, and the price differences are only due to bottlenecks in the grids. So trading is like implicit in the market system in Europe, and it was the Norwegian and Nordic market model that was expanded to now cover most of Europe. And trading within Norway is taking place in 3 different price zones to kind of respect the bottlenecks in the grid. So another point which also differs, where Norway differed from Canada, is that it's just the grids now that are monopolies. So we have separated the transmission and generation completely. So for generation, it's a free market grid. Both the transmission grid and distribution grids are monopolies, regulated. And us, the end users, we can choose retailer, and we also have hourly billing. So we kind of have some mechanisms in place that is quite useful. So what is then electric security of supply in a Norwegian and Nordic context? It's both that we have sufficient power capacity and energy capacity that we have stored enough water in our reservoirs to deal with the high demands that happens in the winter, and also the demand during the spring before the ice melts on the lakes, because until then we don't get any new inflow. So we've already kind of made a power system and production planning way to deal with long-term weather uncertainty. But going beyond security of supply, we have done some studies on the Nordic scale regarding vulnerabilities, and we can then categorize them into three main vulnerabilities. That is, one is power system failures, like power lines and generator outages and so forth. And then if we have sufficient energy inflow and stored energy and sufficient power capacities. And if we look at the power system, to make a and to build a resilient power system, it needs to withstand different types of disturbances and changes that are not only technical and natural, but also social and also related to new type of threats. And the first consequences that we see will be higher prices, but then also more rationing of energy and possible blackouts can be consequences. Looking from now and forward and updating the kind of risk, the map of risks, we see that many of the opportunities that we speak of in terms of decarbonization and clean energy are also new risks for the power system. So electrification is going on in full scale. We now have of new car sales, about 98% are fully electric in Norway, and we also foresee that maybe almost a doubling of the electricity demand towards 2050 as part of decarbonization. But that means that the power system will be even more important than today in the energy supply. And digitalization and more complex power system is also both, I would say, like opportunities and threats. And then finally, which is the main topic here, is the impact of climate change. So now let's continue about the consequences of climate change. So for the operation of the power system. So what can we do? One thing regarding our dependency on hydropower is that to diversify energy supplies is one thing that really can make us less vulnerable for what we call dry years or 2 dry years in a row, which is typically a dimensioning factor for our system. So if we consider wind power, which of course it's not like if you look at from hour to hour, wind power production is not that reliable. It's not controllable in the same way as reservoir hydropower, but it has the benefit that the winter production is statistically much higher than the summer production. And as seen from the statistics, wind power production is very much in line with the power demand over the year, while the inflow to the hydro reservoirs are the opposite, because it's not because that it doesn't snow during the winter, it does in Norway as well, but it's because of that the lakes freezes. But we need to consider that the dry years also then it also then happens that the wind speeds on average annually are lower in the years where we have less water inflow. But diversification of energy supply is one way. Another way, as I touched upon earlier, is to increase interconnection with other countries that have other characteristics in the power system. So in normal years, what typically happens is that the Norwegian hydropower works as a balancing resource for the other countries. When we have more rainfall than normal, we export more than we import, which then reduces the need for fossil fuels in the importing countries. While in the dry years, these interconnections becomes very important for us, because then we can deal with longer periods without inflow, because we then import power to avoid rationing of demand, which would be the case if our reservoirs goes empty. That cannot happen. And just to give an example from practice, this type of balancing, it happens every day. So this is just an example from the exchange between Norway and Denmark. So when it's low wind in Denmark, they have higher prices, and the higher prices will then drive export from Norway to Denmark. And when the wind picks up later in the same day, the flow will be reversed because they will then have lower prices than us. So the market kind of facilitates this integration and also reduces the risk of changes in weather. So what can we expect in the future? So short story is that climate change will cause the places in Norway which already have a lot of rain will be more rainy, and the dry areas will be more dry. And most of our hydropower plants are, of course, in the areas with high mountains and quite much rain already. So it actually means that, seen from the power system side, climate change will give us more annual generation from hydropower and wind power. And also the season with freezing of the lakes will be shorter. So actually that means that you can say that we can be quite lucky with that type of change. But it comes, with some unwanted consequences, because the extreme situations will also increase. This is an example from 2 years ago. We had the drought, and this came at the same time as we had the European energy crisis, and with very high prices. We also had very low reservoir levels due to a little inflow. And just a year after, it was a large flooding in the same area. So things happen very fast. And the hydropower plants, they can actually, unless they break like this, they actually can do quite good in cases of flooding. So now the Norwegian Energy and Water Directorate has decided that all lakes, all dams in the whole of Norway has to be extended and strengthened to deal with climate change. Finally, when it comes to how we plan operations in hydropower and market analysis and all these things that also I work with as a researcher, I think we had a quite slow start in adapting our power system models with more updated data on, let's say, climate adjusted inflow parameters. But now we have several large projects where we not only update all the inflows, weather data, extreme events, and we run the 2050 analysis to check, okay, what kind of changes does the weather change has on the market prices and the reliability of supply. So to wrap up, we already are 100% weather dependent. And the interconnections and the common markets that we have with other countries really help us to build a more resilient, I would say, power system in all respects. We can expect significant impact on inflows, more rain, more inflows, but also more damages. And the climate policy is already make a significant impact already on how we use our hydropower system. And finally, which is not the talk of today, but very important in our research, is that all these changes that we do and adoptions also we need to take into account local environmental constraints in hydropower operation, and where we also build wind farms that may cause the flexibility of the hydropower to be a bit less in the future, but it will also then respect the local environment in a better way. So with that, I think I can close the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnus, and we'll take questions from both presentations afterwards, and lots of interesting elements to what you were saying there, and actually a really great segue. Thank you to the next presentation, because you talked about, what does it look like when you adapt power system models and bring in climate adjusted data, and what do you find when you do that? And our next two presenters are right involved in that business, not only within the electricity systems, but for clients from all different sectors and governments right across Canada. So we have here Trevor Murdoch and Katie Pearson. They're with the Canadian Centre for Climate Services of Environment and Climate Change Canada. And we're incredibly lucky that they're situated right here in Victoria, in fact, just off of the IESVic campus, and is a huge center of excellence for the whole country. So the Canadian Centre for Climate Services is providing both, again, in the Halloween context, treats for all of us. They're providing data and information that we need, and also lots of climate tricks for us, because tools and training for Canadians to make climate smart decisions and plan for the future. So Trevor himself has spent over 25 years working in applied climate science and to assist decision-making and planning. And he's currently, since for the last 4 years or so, been the manager of data and products with the Canadian Centre for Climate Services. And these are data sets that have been consolidated across all levels of government, national professional organizations, climate consortia, and international organizations. So really a pooling of a very significant pooling of data. And Katie is a key part of the service delivery team and comes from an educational background. And you really see that in the types of tools that they have developed. Tools that are really helping people use climatedata.ca to help people find and understand and use climate information. So looking forward very much to what you have to say.
I'm a little shorter. Oh, and now I've broken it. There we go. All right. So thank you very much. And we're really excited to be here today to speak with you about climate data, our services that help the resilient energy systems. So I won't do our intros again, but I will just acknowledge as well that we're speaking to you today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Lekwungen peoples and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, both in, like you were saying, Stephanie, that we're here today with you, but also it's where I live and work, and Trevor as well. So we're going to do something a little different. You've been here for the day, it's the afternoon. We thought moving around might be a good thing. So we're inviting you, if you answer this question with a yes, to stand up. So can everybody stand up if you have considered climate change in your work? Stand up. All right, fantastic. Yes, that's what I like to see. All right. Next question. Please stay standing if you have used future climate data in your work. Have you used, wow, well done. Okay, this is really, this is great. All right, they're getting tougher. Have you moved on from using historical data alone and always use future climate data in aspects of your work? Yep. Oh, awesome. Well done. And lastly, have you found future climate data for every hazard you were interested in and had zero difficulties making use of them? Yes. So the purpose of those questions is really to, demonstrate that there's a lot of us already considering climate data, that climate change data in the work that we're doing. So that's fantastic. But also the space that Trevor and I work in is really, we're hoping that with the work that we do, the work that we do with others, that you'll all be standing by the end of these questions at some point in time. That's the ultimate goal of climate services. So this brings us to our 3 key messages for today, our takeaway messages. So we know that climate change is happening and it's affecting the energy sector. There's resilience requires future climate information, and that data, assistance, and guidance are available. All right, I have one more question for you, but you don't have to move for this one. So I'd like you to think about, what are those potential risks to transmission systems? What are those things that are keeping you up at night? And I won't ask you to share them, just take a moment to think about them. Yeah, jump out at you. We should have thought of that one.
Jump scare.
Yeah. All right, so we're hoping that maybe this this graphic from the Canadian Electricity Association might resonate with some of the things you were thinking about. So maybe you're worried about sea level change and storm surge affecting your shoreline infrastructure, or perhaps it's the warmer temperatures and more frequent heat waves that might impact your electricity demand. Is it wildfire risk in interrupting your transmission and distribution, or snowpack and changes in snowpack, precipitation, and others that might be affecting your hydroelectric operations? Probably some of these things are resonating with you right now. So what we wanted to say is that, these are the types of things that we're trying to connect the data to so that you can make some changes toward. And I'll hand things over now to Trevor.
Thanks, Katie. So yeah, I'm going to pick it up and say just there's a lot of information on this slide. The takeaways here is we've actually heard in every talk, I think so far, every speaker has mentioned that first of our 3 takeaways, that climate change is already happening and is affecting the electricity sector or the energy sector. Everyone has mentioned the increasing extreme events and things like that. So the first one, and the evidence for that is has been getting stronger with every IPCC assessment report cycle. One of the things that we don't focus on as much, but I think is really important, especially for for energy systems, is that until we get to net zero, climate will continue to change. So we don't get to a stable climate until we get to net zero, and that there's no going back to that previous climate. So Magnus was starting to allude to needing to take future climate projections into account into planning energy systems. And we'll get later in this to some of the reasons why it's difficult. Everyone was down before that last question. Could you find those future projections very easily for everything you needed? And so that's often an excuse not to take the future projections into account. But since there's no one going back to historical climate, if we're using historical data alone, only instead, because it's too hard, we're using data we're using climate data that we know is not suitable for the future planning. That's definitely a climate that we're not going to experience. So we want to, even if it's hard, even if it's imperfect, we'd rather use something that's closer to what we're going to experience than something we definitely know is not the future climate we're going to experience. So that's the sort of the main thing. Yeah, the other thing here too, just the pace and scale of recent changes. Not only recent changes, but also what we're looking at over the scale of, the next 100 years. We have not in human history had even a 10,000 year span with as much change as we will experience in the next 100 years, even the next 50 years. So it's too big to just sort of sweep under the rug. And this image is hopefully animated. Is it animated? It was animated when we tested it earlier. There's go. Okay, good. So this is kind of meant to illustrate that in a sort of energy relevant variable. Okay, good. I don't have to keep toggling it. So what we're looking at here, it's the building zones in Canada. So this is based on heating degree days, counting up the number, the amount of time during a year when temperatures are below 18 degrees. So it's a demand thing. But the reason we show it here, these climate zones are very different from each other. Each of these colors represents a zone that's quite different. And the animation, we're seeing the climate zones move from 1950 through to the end of the 21st century. And you would never we would never design buildings or design transmission infrastructure or any kind of infrastructure for a climate zone that's different. You wouldn't use data from the blue zone for something that's happening in the red zone. But if you look at any one place as the animation is going behind me, there is no place where the climate zone that it starts in 1950 is still the same climate zone as at the end of the century. So again, just reinforcing this, that the magnitude of change is too large to ignore. That makes sense? Okay, and then returning to these three themes, climate change is happening and is affecting the energy sector. We didn't dwell on that one too much, but kind of build the case for resilience requires future climate data. And so we're going to get into that second one now. Where do you get that? So in Canada, one of the main sources you would go to for getting future climate projections is climatedata.ca. It's been mentioned. And I know it's the international audience, so I've got a slide. We've got a slide coming up that shows you can get this sort of data wherever you're at. And so, but in Canada, climatedata.ca, there are many other portals as well. Climate Atlas is a national portal that's widely used. Some of the energy sector relevant data that you can find there. Here's an example of mostly temperature and precipitation related indices, although we're starting to move beyond those into more relevant and more useful variables. Wind is one that's very much of interest. It's trickier to do, but of course very relevant. And again, just I won't read them all off here, but you can see how some of the different variables there, building zones we've just looked at, how they relate to the energy sector. And yeah, as I mentioned, so we are the national climate service provider. In Canada, we work very closely with regional climate service providers because, thinking back to the exercise we did at the beginning there and how everyone went down as we asked, are you actually taking future climate into account? And is it easy to do that? It's easy for me to say that, climate is changing so much that you should take it into account in everything that we do because the past is no longer happening, but it's hard to do because we have never in any sector planned for a changing climate in human history before. So there's a lot to it. And as a result of that, these regional climate service providers, and Katie in a moment is going to say more about what climate services are and what they do. But the important point is that these regional climate service providers exist, and you really need to, it's really important that the regional services exist so you can, the issues in BC are very different from the issues in the prairies and in Quebec and in the north. And the same thing is true globally. And so for those of you in Europe, Copernicus is sort of the main European climate service provider. But again, there are national climate service providers and subnational climate service providers in Europe as well. And some other sources listed there as well. And I will I got a couple more slides before I pass back to Katie. In terms of sort of actually using future climate projections, I want to show this one slide from Dr. Francis Zweers, who would have loved to be here, but is traveling. He's done PKIC, they're one of the regional climate service providers I just mentioned, has done some work with the BC Transmission Corporation over several years, using those future projections and the Transmission Corporation thinking through what are their aspects of their operations are vulnerable to a changing climate, and just listed some of them here. I won't read through all of these. The one I'll pick out on, because it's kind of interesting and connects to Magnus's talk, is the extreme snow depth reducing clearance. So from the micro scale of transmission infrastructure, the extreme snow depth is potentially causing damage to transmission infrastructure. It might sound like a counterintuitive one. How would we get increasing extreme snow depth when climate's warming? But this is actually really important, a little tangent to go on, because it's relevant to generation as well. As Magnus said, in general, wet places are getting even wetter. That's true. That's kind of a globally true thing. Wet places and wet times of year are generally getting wetter, no matter where you are, and warming at the same time. What that means for a place like BC, where a lot of our generating capacity is at very high elevations, cold locations, in the short term, we are actually expecting increasing generating capacity from our dams, while our neighbors to the south, they're a little bit further south, their dams are at a little bit lower elevation. They are facing, and we don't have the benefit of the rain-driven dams that Norway has. We really rely on both sides of the border, rely on snowpack storage. And so we're facing a short-term increase in generating capacity here, and then eventually disappearance of that. So many elements to that, but also the extreme events themselves, posing an issue for transmission. And as keep alluding back to, we know it's difficult. Here are some of the sort of barriers that you might run into. We hope that we are speaking to some keeners who might want to go back, and a lot of you were standing through the first two questions, so I think that we already know a lot of you are the keeners who, even though it's hard, will go back and say, yeah, well, in our modeling, we really should be taking the future climate projections into account here. You will hear all of these things from your peers when you try to do that. Your mandate doesn't include it, it's too expensive. The codes and standards aren't telling us to do this, but that's, again, a circular argument. We don't have codes and standards for a changing climate because we've never designed for a changing climate before. It's going to take 30 years for codes and standards to figure out how to grapple with changing climate. So we're just starting to do that now, working with our partners in other departments. So with that, as promised, I'm going to hand back to Katie.
Do you know these slides yet? Do you know our key messages? One more time. So we're moving in now to the key message around the data assistance and guidance are available. So what are those climate services? So what is it that we do? The way that I explain it is that we're sort of that space between the research that's taking place and the people who want to use it. So I really enjoy the work that we do because it's bringing together the data with the people and trying to make it usable and working with both sides. So it's very collaborative. We don't do it on our own. And so we're creating new data sets. We're looking at what already exists, but what do you need and how can we find something that works for you? We do workshops and guidance, but again, it's collaborative. I don't know what you need to know, and so we work together to do that. That's kind of what climate services are. It's really working together to make data accessible, but also usable. You may have seen this before. It's an adaptation cycle. This is a process, a planning process. It's iterative. And what we're showing here is that climate services can be part of that planning process. In this case, it's in the understanding how climate will change part of the process, step 2, where we're helping to connect people with historical climate data, that future climate data. We also tailor products. So we try and do self-serve, try and make things available to people in a way that they can use themselves, but we also try to tailor things based on what people actually need and make it, again, accessible, usable, and relevant to the work that you're doing. And then again, providing resources and information. This is another example of a framework, probably something similar. You might have one that looks like this. This is again from the Canadian Electricity Association. And in this case, where we would fit into step 3 in terms of identifying those key potential climate impacts. So what we're trying to say is, go back and consider, do you have an adaptation plan like this? Where could climate services fit in? And can you reach out to maybe us, maybe a regional partner, and try and get that connection and build that climate data in. And I think also one of the messages that Trevor and I wanted to bring today too is that just because it isn't there doesn't mean it couldn't be. And we really want to hear from people about what is it that you need to help move your work forward. And then we try and find, is the science there? Do we have data that can be, worked in a way that's usable for you? It's not always happening overnight, but we are working towards improving the data and then also improving the usability of that data for people who need to use it. And if you haven't seen it enough, there are 3 messages one last time. I'm going to hand it back to Trevor to wrap up.
Okay, yeah, we just wanted to end on this. It's kind of a separate, it's like a bonus extra point, just on the theme of Halloween and just to be scary. Although I think it's motivating. It's motivating going ahead and getting in touch with your regional climate service provider if you're having difficulty making use of like the automated portals and things like that. If it looks like the variables you really need aren't there, reach out and bug them. And so what this is a news story about OSFI. This is the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions in Canada. It's just one example, but it's a current one, so that's why we're using it. That right now, it's not necessarily a requirement that future climate get taken into account, but requirements are coming. And so currently all major financial institutions in Canada are required to assess and disclose their climate risk. And it's a tricky thing to even do. There's no objective. You can't just spend a couple hours or just hire a consulting company to tell you the objectively correct answer to this. There's a lot of there's a lot of data that is not readily available. OSFI contacted us, for example, to see if we could make our fire weather indices, which we were working on, available to be used. But even there, it's a lot of there's a lot of steps between future projections of fire weather indices and what is my total fire risk and how do you translate that into dollars. Yet these requirements are coming. They exist already. So if you go out of your way and incorporate future climate projections, start thinking about doing that in your, whether it's energy modeling or whatever aspect of energy sector you're working on, you're going to be a little bit ahead of the game because some of these requirements are going to be coming. So we'll end there. We have a bunch of resources as well. We're not going to speak to these. We're going to go to, but just so you know, I skimmed through them. They're all in the slides that'll be shared with you. For those of you, especially in Canada, who are interested in climatedata.ca, there's a lot of info in the slides I just skipped. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much. And yeah, we're all at the precipice of lots of very known unknowns, I guess it is what they are. And trying to figure out how to navigate into that unknown future. We've only got 10 minutes for questions, so I think I'll go straight to questions from the floor first. Any questions about the Nordic experience or about kind of how climatedata.ca is working with different sectors? I've got Madeline and then Jennifer. Oh, Jennifer first, yeah. Sorry, is it Jennifer? I can't read your name tag. Yes, go ahead.
Hello. Oh, yes. I was just wondering if any examples could be given on models, electricity system models, like capacity expansion models that have used future climate projections. I actually did attempt to do this for my master's thesis and had the visceral experience of how challenging it was. So I'd be very interested to hear some examples of where it has worked out.
Yeah. Yeah, good question. So regarding capacity expansion models for power systems and energy systems, now the first, main challenge regarding input data, it was to get researchers and analysts to use more than one like reference year when representing wind and solar and hydropower and potentially temperature. So the first big step was like to go from average year to maybe use a sample of 30 or 20 or 10 years of data to kind of get more robust results. So I think that we are a bit late when it comes to, also adapting the data to also include possible climate change, that will change the parameters or at least change which weather years that you draw when you when you select or automatically select the year. So I think we're kind of more at the stage now that, okay, how to, well, we can solve these two problems in one time. That okay, we need representative years in capacity expansion planning. So let's pick the representative years that takes into account the probable distribution of wind and solar annually for the planning horizon instead of just looking back. So I think it's possible. So we haven't done that ourselves. What we have done is that we have run market simulations with climate adjusted inflow data and wind data and so forth. So there are examples of that, but not, as I know, with investment planning.
In Canada, both in BC, BC Hydro was a founding partner in the Pacific Climate Impact Consortium, and Hydro-Quebec in the founding of RENOS. And so, they're really members of the regional climate service providers, the hydro utility in both cases, for exactly this reason, because future climate is so important to generating. So it's there in these two provinces. But I'm not as, they're using it for their own internal planning. They're not necessarily publishing, they're not necessarily publishing their modeling as an open source or in an academic way. And so I know in BC, and I'm not sure if this is the case in Quebec or not, but in BC, they're also have taken future climate into account. They've used the future climate projections in the demand side modeling as well. And it is really not straightforward, right? Because they're members of the consortium, they were able to pick our brains, and it took a year and a half, and it still wasn't fully incorporated. So that's just the nature of the system, but it's baby steps. So I applaud you for taking it into account, for trying.
Yes.
Yeah, I would just like to ask a follow-up question, because you also mentioned the IESVic example. So I feel like, we have on one side very, high resolution and complex climate models, and then these capacity expansion models. But then we are talking also about translating those to the financial, financial risk and institution. So what do you think, or do you know about any efforts which are being done to basically, make different disciplinary people sit on a table and, come together with an integrated solution, rather than like a capacity expansion model is trying to understand, very deep or complex climate language, or similar for the financial people?
I think that's a great question. I think it's a question for Edouard, probably more than for me. but it's from climate services perspective, we're kind of agnostic in terms of who we work with. We're happy to work with individuals, but you know, the place I see that happening the most is risk assessment. Stephanie mentioned earlier the provincial BC climate risk assessments, where you have sort of transdisciplinary people in the room who are talking to each other. They're not necessarily taking climate data into account explicitly in modeling. They're just doing it in their heads with their expert opinion, arguing with each other in the room. And that is very beneficial. You know, that has a lot of results. So I think that sounds great. I'm not familiar with, I haven't seen a lot of that happening.
It's just one of the impacts that I saw up there was around temperature-induced sag and derates on lines. And I guess I was just curious if you'd run across some good climate-based modeling that incorporated looking at advanced conductors as a possible mitigation to that.
For me is no, I don't know.
Okay, that's a quick answer. Basma, did you have a question?
Thank you. Just wanted to build on the previous question. I'm a finance professor. I worked using climate scenario data for assessing risks on portfolios of like, let's say, a pension fund or and it's super difficult to actually go from those kind of macro level climate scenario up to 2050 or whatever, and you know, embed that into financial models. And then also, it's not just, you know, you talked about IESVic, but even like in the business community now with the mandatory disclosure that is becoming more and more like basically mandatory for most publicly listed companies. A lot of businesses will have to do climate-related disclosure, how climate scenarios, you know, it includes an assessment under different climate scenarios. And it's also very, very difficult for businesses to understand also the interconnection. Many businesses depend on other sectors, like you can understand the impact on one sector, but there's like ripple effects and feedback loops and all that stuff. It is like impossible to understand the impact. And I wonder, like, you know, what can be done to develop like some sort of like guidance on in terms of like going from those kind of science-based climate scenario data and then, you know, translate it into different needs, because different people will use it differently, but we're not there yet. And so even those who want to do it or who must do it, they often struggle how to do it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. That's really the reason that climate services exists, you know, because each profession is doing this independently. Kind of links to the last question as well, right? Every profession is dealing with the fact that we're not set up to engineer bridges or build buildings or design transmission systems or in a changing climate. And so our systems are not set up for that. We're here to try to make it easier and to try to develop guidance. I mean, one of the things on climatedata.ca that we didn't really mention, but it's why we need people like Katie in climate services, is if you look at, there's a whole section called Learning Zone there. And if you look at the Learning Zone now versus just two or 3 years ago, there is a lot more guidance in general, and also some specific guidance. We're starting to get down to the level of detail of providing tutorials on how to use common data file formats that people might not have used. And we're starting to get into different guidance for different sectors. And so it's an emerging field. And I think what you're describing is that's the barrier. That's the reason we exist, and we're constantly working away at it. Yeah, that's why we kind of making the case that like for the keeners.
Great. Well, we have panel members with young trick-or-treaters who are waiting at home. So we're going to give them a big round of thanks.